First order of business. Are there any bill introductions? Any bill introductions? Seeing none. Well, let's get into it. I'm assuming we have several online that are attending. So with that, we'll begin the meeting. We are honored today to have Kent Asprin from the Kansas Farm Bureau to come and speak to us about the Farm Bureau public policy, and I'm hoping it's surrounded around water. Welcome to the committee, sir.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to stand before you this morning, share a little bit of a few comments on water. I represent Kansas Farm Bureau, the state's largest general farm organization with over 30,000 farm and ranch members and 105 county Farm Bureau associations, all of whom depend significantly on water for their livelihood. So this is a very relevant topic for our membership and of course for our state. My name is Kent Asprin. I serve as the Public Policy Director for Kansas Farm Bureau. I guess I've kind of worked in water pretty much my entire career. My dad was a water well driller, so I grew up around that industry. Out of college, I went to work for the Division of Water Resources for 19 years, administering the water laws of our state. And then for the last 19 years, I've had the privilege of working for Kansas Farm Bureau and sharing my knowledge of water and water law in the state of Kansas with our membership. Today, I'd like to primarily focus on about 5 basic topics. We could spend hours, as some of you have been told I tend to like to do sometimes, talking about water, but we won't do that today. Primarily, I'd like to visit a little bit about some of the water planning that goes on in our state, the water legal system, water management, of course, funding. We always have to talk about funding, and I just want to plant a few seeds, I guess, for thoughts on what the Kansas landscape might look like with and without water as we move forward and as you work on very complex water issues. First off, I'd like to get everyone to think a little bit about the public awareness of water and our water policy processes. I really believe, at least it's been my experience, that the general population is pretty unaware of what goes on in Kansas in regards to water. We turn the tap and water comes out, and unfortunately that's about the extent of our general knowledge of that. Kansas Farm Bureau policy supports the Kansas Water Plan process. I'm sure you're all familiar with that now. You've heard, I think, numerous testimony on how that process works. Of course, two of the biggest issues and items that the committee or that the planning process has to deal with is with aquifer decline and with reservoir sedimentation, two huge and major undertakings by our state. Very complex issues that require thoughtful analyzation, planning, managing, conservation, and utilization of our water resources that are critical to the economics of our state. Our policy book is absolutely chock full of support for local grassroots efforts. So that's I believe is the way that our Kansas water planning process is also geared. So we support that and try to encourage our members to be as involved with that as possible. But we believe that education on these issues is still somewhat lacking, especially in the fundamental aspects of our water law. You know, if we were to walk down Kansas Avenue and ask how many people know much of anything about Kansas water law, I think it would be pretty close to zero. So that's a very important platform to work off of when you're dealing with water in Kansas. So the legal system, the natural resource itself, the condition of the resource, and of course our conservation efforts are all imperative when we talk about water in Kansas. I'd like to talk a little more about that legal process in Kansas because it's foundational and it's very mature. We're now 75 years into the Kansas Water Appropriation Act, which was instituted back in 1945. And I know you've had briefings by several experts on this topic, so I will try not to belabor too much of that. But I think these are key principles that we must keep in mind, whatever our conversation is about water. We need to understand what those principles are. And we're very fortunate. Previous legislatures made that very clear for us. They set specifically in statute what our guiding principles are when we're talking about the appropriation of water. They've left little doubt to what that principle is. It's basically when we're dealing with water and there's insufficient water supply, to meet that demand, we are to distribute the water based upon the water right priority, regardless of the type of use. Now, that's a very critical principle to keep in mind as we build upon the platform of our water law. So all of these challenges, the ones that we've already seen, and there will be more in the future, we know there will be, we have to have some sort of principles that we stand upon to deal with those challenges. And so I wanted to make sure that there was no misunderstanding of what our principles are in our water law. Why is this concept so important? Well, one reason is that water rights are real property rights. And we know that Kansas is a strong property rights state. So we want to make sure that we do everything to recognize, appreciate, and protect those property rights. One thing that I've found challenging over my career is to convince people that, be it Farm Bureau members or when I work for the Division of Water Resources for the general public, to convince them that the law states that they don't own the water. When we own land, we think that anything that's on that land or under that land is ours. Well, water is not a mineral right, like oil or something like that. So water is owned by the general population for distribution by appropriation through the authority granted to the chief engineer. And what's significant here, and that's why these principles remain so important, the protection of that private property right is done by its priority. First in time, first in right. That's what gives value. That's what gives certainty for the investment. So the priority is extremely critical in the protection of that private property right. If we choose to disregard that aspect of our water law, something different is going to be used to replace that. And quite frankly, I believe that that can lead to chaos. I think that it can put such uncertainty into how water is going to be distributed that it's going to make challenges for us economically, and who's willing to make investments not knowing for sure what the game rules are down the road. So it's a very critical principle that we need to keep in mind as we move forward. You've also heard that from others that, and I would just reiterate that be very cautious and calculating in any modifications to the Water Appropriation Act. It's a very complex network, if you will, and the principles that I mentioned earlier is what a lot of that is built upon. Anytime you change a component of that, it has a cause and effect. And so we need to be aware of any effects that it may have before we would take and make any modifications to that. We don't want to end up in costly legal litigation with a lot of these issues. And I think our water law is sound enough that we can make our decisions built upon that platform and feel pretty secure that we're in a good position there. Under the Kansas Water Appropriation Act, there's numerous times that it recognizes the chief engineer and the authority of the chief engineer. It's very explicit that the chief engineer has is the main administrator and the enforcer of our Kansas water law. Housing of the chief engineer is currently within the Department of Agriculture, and our policy supports that. And where the chief engineer is housed does not change that authority that is granted to the chief engineer under the Water Appropriation Act. So I hope that's not a big concern for anyone. We can alter the statute to change that authority, but the way the statute is right now and has been for 75 years, that authority resides with the chief engineer. So that's ultimately where the buck stops in terms of appropriating water in our state. A few years back, there was an effort to unclassify quite a number of state employees, the chief engineer being one of those. We opposed that, and fortunately, we're successful in getting the chief engineer deemed as a classified employee once again. We think that that's extremely important because the chief engineer's job is one of, if not the most challenging, I believe, in state government. When you have that sort of responsibility appropriating water, the very livelihood of every person in the state, much industry in the state, those decisions are important, and they need to remain out of politics. They need to remain based upon the enforcement of the law that you all set. And so we were very happy to see the chief engineer once again made a classified employee. So I didn't always have to be looking behind his or her back for administrative or political backlash. Our policy also supports the chief engineer's position having a competitive salary with its peers. And that's extremely important because we need to have a very qualified, and we've been fortunate to have that, a very qualified individual in that position, and we need to maintain that moving forward. We also think that the powers of our water regulators are so enormous that our policy would not support blending them all under one roof. We think that those need to remain separate, and they're complex enough that I think there's plenty of justification for that to occur. Okay, when it comes to the Ogallala Aquifer, I think you've all heard a great deal about that. We learned probably 50 years ago that the Ogallala was not the inexhaustible water supply that it was once viewed or thought to be. Consequently, previous legislatures back in 1972 instituted what we know as the Groundwater Management District Act. And this act governs each of the 5 groundwater management districts. I think you've seen maps. I think you know where those are all at and know a little bit about them. They all have quite unique challenges. So this is not a cookie cutter approach. This is not a one-size-fits-all. They all have and need tailored goals and remedies to deal with the challenges that they're facing. You probably will remember that groundwater management districts, or GMDs as I'll refer to them, 1, 3, and 4 are the groundwater management districts that overlie the Ogallala Aquifer on the western edge of our state. This is the vast underground water supply that ranges from the Dakotas to Texas that is being depleted and that has minimal recharge. So efforts are critical to help address this and establish goals to determine our destiny for the use of that. So GMDs 1, 3, and 4 have the somewhat unenviable task of trying to deal with those issues in the Ogallala. On the other hand, groundwater management districts 2 and 5 are somewhat in a better position. They have consistent recharge in the aquifers where they are at. So even though they do have definite challenges, like all the GMDs do, they are at least have the recharge so that their hopefully their strategies will result in the desired outcomes. Each of these groundwater management districts, when they're coming up with their strategies, those strategies are to comply with the existing basic laws and policies of the states. That's written right in the Groundwater Management District Act. I want to talk a little bit more about the makeup of the GMDs. Each groundwater management district is required to have a management program. And this management program helps them deal with the water quality and quantity supply challenges that they have within their district. The management program is developed by the GMD managers, who are all elected officials. That proposal, and it's just a proposal at that point, then goes to the chief engineer for examination. And the chief engineer has to make sure that it is compatible with existing laws, primarily the Water Appropriation Act and the Groundwater Management District Act. So it's very important that that process work of the local management plan strategy and the chief engineer overview of that needs to be a good working relationship in the development of that management program. The program itself is designed to help preserve the basic water use doctrine and give locals a voice in their destiny in dealing with these in some cases, declining and diminishing water resources that they deal with. And this is to be done without conflicting with our basic water laws and policies, which is a key point to understand. When we talk about the development of this management program, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that a couple of years back, we met with both the GMDs and the Kansas Department of Agriculture to talk about the whole process of management of the water resources through the GMDs. And to be quite honest, it's no great secret. There have been challenges there. These go back, in some cases, decades. In some cases, they're just personal and organizational relationships that need to be improved. But there need to be clear and agreeable goals for these very precious resources established, especially in the Ogallala, but all of the GMDs across the state. So we got to make sure that this process works, and it's struggled a little bit. I don't think anybody would disagree with that. If they do, I certainly welcome them sharing that with you. But just in my observations over the years, I've seen that there have been challenges there, and we need to work out those details. It was encouraging last week to hear Chief Engineer Earl Lewis tell us that the Groundwater Management District 3 management program was recently approved. So that's a great step forward, and hopefully we can continue to see improvement on those relationships. Turn a little bit to local enhanced management areas, LEMAs, as they are referred to. I'm sure you've all heard about them. Some of you maybe been out there to see that in person. They've received a tremendous amount of accolade, and they've been very successful to this point. But one question I would like for you to think about is, again, what are our ultimate goals for the Ogallala, really for any water supply in our state? Extending and conserving has been sort of the platform we've worked off for a number of years. I really wonder if we're ready to advance that goal to something else. Is it enough to just extend the life? Does that still mean that there's a date out there where we're not going to have life with that water supply anymore? If it is, that should be very troubling to us, and we should be maybe rethinking what those goals are. The other thing is if we do set different goals, how are we going to accomplish those goals? I would tell you that I think if we look at our basic principles again in our water law, that to socialize our water or to target mandatory remedies or administration to just certain types of users, I don't believe that aligns quite well with our underlying principles in our water law. And I told you some of the pitfalls that could result in earlier. So I think we need to be very careful about subjectively applying the enforcement aspects of our water law. But I think the first thing is to set goals. We need to know what the goals are going to be for the indefinite, not just the next 5, 10, 30 years. We can't have life without water, and so we have to make sure that those become, I believe, conversations about indefinite water supplies. Let's see, step forward just a little bit here. I would encourage you to take a look at the Groundwater Management District Act if you have not had the chance to do so. I like to think of, and maybe I'm not a lawyer, I should have said that from the get-go. I like to think of it this way. We have at the core is the Water Appropriation Act, Kansas Water Appropriation Act. And that's what I was referring to when I was talking about the basic principles within our water law. I like to think of the Groundwater Management District Act as sort of a layer around that inner core. They're to work hand in glove together. And I think that's the way they were originally designed to work. And if you look within the Groundwater Management District Act, they're designed to help fulfill the roles of developing, utilizing, and protecting water rights consistent with their priority indefinitely, I believe. But the one thing that I want to make sure as you're looking at groundwater management districts and maybe the makeup of groundwater management districts is that the statute also emphasizes that they were designed for the stabilization of agriculture. So I think we'd have to be very careful that any oversight for a groundwater management district, make sure that we keep agriculture front and center. I'm not saying that it has to be all-inclusive, and probably shouldn't be, but it definitely needs to be well represented on all of the groundwater management districts, and I think it has been over the years, no doubt about that. There's a tremendous amount of work that has been done by the groundwater management districts that I think has quite frankly been gone unrecognized. So I would encourage, I guess it's easy for me to say, but I would encourage you to have the groundwater management districts present before you to share some of the work that they're doing. And I think it will be possibly eye-opening to get an understanding of all of the details, the challenges that they have to work with, and the details that they have to apply to fulfill their mission. Okay, our policy also supports the Kansas water planning process in its efforts to plan, manage, conserve, and utilize the waters of the state. Integral to that planning process is, of course, money. We can have the greatest plan in history sitting on the shelf, but if we don't have money to implement that plan, then that plan really is for naught. We fully support the state water plan being fully funded. And by that, I think you all know what I mean. We support the $6 million state general fund demand transfer and the $2 million economic development initiatives fund into the state water plan fund, that $8 million of that general money that is to come in there. I would remind the committee as you contemplate funding that agriculture and municipal entities have propped up the fund for many years. We have contributed regularly on a yearly basis. And so as we look for resources or look at resources for the full funding of the state water plan, I hope we will keep that in mind and appreciate that as we try to seek these much needed resources to implement conservation projects all across the state. I think we've heard we're $80–90 million in arrear from losses of the state general fund, that's money that should have come in. It just makes me wonder today what practices could be on the ground today, what challenges maybe would have been met if we had had that full $80 million. So we really need a consistent contribution from the general state revenue stream to help hold up the state water plan fund. Okay, the last topic that I'd like to visit with you about this morning is maybe one that you have not heard a great deal about, but I think it is, for me anyway, it's sort of a sleeping giant, and that deals with domestic water use. What do I mean by domestic water use? Well, that is actually a beneficial use recognized in our state water law. There are 14 distinct beneficial uses of water set forth in regulation. And domestic use is quite unique in our water law. All uses of water, with the exception of domestic, are required to have a permit from the chief engineer before water use commences. That is not the case with domestic. You can actually begin using water for domestic purposes today without a permit from the chief engineer. By putting that water to beneficial use, you begin your priority and the perfection or the development of a domestic water supply. If you choose to, you can actually even make an application with the chief engineer. And that would set your line in the stand and establish your priority that way as well. The key thing is, though, with all of these domestic water rights not being required to have a permit, which is a good thing, by the way. I'm not saying that we need to go out and get all of them permitted. But by not having them, we don't know how many there are out there. It is difficult to quantify them. It is difficult to pin them all down. We have some record of that, but not nearly to the extent that they exist. When you think about domestic rights, what I'm talking about is water that is used for household purposes, for the watering of lawns, gardens, orchards to the extent of 2 acres or less. Here's the big one, for livestock out on pasture. These would be not the large confinement facilities. That would be classified as stock watering. That does require a permit from the chief engineer. But as you're driving down the highway, on your way home this weekend, I just challenge you to take a look across the countryside. Probably many of the houses that you see in the countryside, many of those will have a well. That'll be a domestic use of water. Every head of livestock you see out on pasture is probably drinking from water that came out of a well, out of a stream, out of a pond, out of a spring. Each and every one of those is a domestic water right. They just may not have made a matter of record with the chief engineer. So this is an enormous category of water use in our state, and it's an extremely important one. One more thing about those that I should note that often goes unrecognized. I mentioned priority and the importance of priority. Domestic rights are probably the most senior rights in our state as well, because in most cases, when you look at those farmsteads, when you look at those livestock on pasture, it wasn't the current operator that started that. It probably wasn't his father before him. It was probably at least his grandfather or great-grandfather before them that started that operation, and that's when that priority is established for that unquantified domestic water right. I hope that has you thinking just a little bit about the countryside and the enormity of domestic water supply impact on our water resources in the state. The sobering part of that I would like for you to think about is what happens if we don't have that water supply across the state? What does the countryside look like then? And how do we deal with that challenge? And what goals do we need to set today to keep that from happening? And what do we need to implement to make that goal possible? Those are big questions. I wish I had the answers for you. That's why you all get paid the big bucks, right? But it's a key issue in our state that I think oftentimes goes unnoticed. And I really would like to see that brought to the forefront in planning, implementation, goals, resources, everything. But I know several years ago we were on a vacation near the Grand Canyon, and if you've all been there, you know what the countryside is like right before you get to the Grand Canyon. And I noticed a stock tank a few hundred yards off of the road. And on that stock tank, there was a sign that said, "Water is life." And boy, that couldn't have been any more appropriate than out there in that country. Well, it's just as appropriate in our country here as well, and in our countryside. So water, how we manage water, the resources we put into that are all going to be critical for the future of Kansas. I appreciate very much the work that this committee does. I appreciate the chairman's invite today to speak to you, and I would be happy to try and address anything that I did talk about or anything that I failed to talk about that you would like to discuss either today or at your pleasure any other time during the session here. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you for addressing the committee. That's very good. Thank you. Did you give Tony your contact information so that if any of the committee would like to contact you?
Absolutely. Be happy to.
Committee, questions? Representative.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Kent, excuse me, Mr. Asprin.
It's fine.
I've known him way too long, I guess. You know, on these senior rights, many years ago, these water rights were, there was a value or a quantity, I should say, established with those. And maybe we've over appropriated years ago. Is there something that we could do there that might help in the resource being helped out in the Ogallala at some point in time?
What was the final part of the question?
Well, is there something along those lines that we could do to help the Ogallala?
Because of the over appropriation and all.
Correct. I'm sorry, I didn't state that.
No, that's fine. I appreciate that. Well, I hope so. But the key is, and that's why I sort of laid things out the way they are. We have the basic principles of the Water Appropriation Act that I mentioned. Then we have the GMDs, groundwater management districts, and their management program on top of that. And I've worked for years with all of the parties involved here, and maybe it's just me, but I have a little bit of a hard time seeing what the explicit goal or goals are. So I'm not going to stand here and tell you, well, we need to go out and do this, because I don't know what the goals are. And those need to be locally developed. They need to be understood from the statewide perspective as well, in my opinion. And then there needs to be, the really difficult question is then how are we going to implement that? And I know we have some tools that we're using, and we have some challenges. But how long can we wait before we then start seeing the impacts of depopulating the countryside because people no longer can have a viable water supply to live out in the country? That's a really big concern to me. That is by far the major membership of the Kansas Farm Bureau, as you well know. And so, I think that's a big concern. I don't know if that answered your question or not, because I probably don't really have the answer, but I think there's a process. I think there's a process to come up with that answer.
So the GMDs would be the area that we need to look through for guidance, I guess, in their general areas.
I'm sorry, Joe, what was that again?
The GMDs are the ones that we should be looking for to make those types of decisions, I guess.
They are the ones that make the recommendations to the chief engineer that ultimately get into their management program. Yes. So that's a great place to start.
Thank you a lot for your testimony. Appreciate it.
Representative Fairchild.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have a comment rather than a question. You had mentioned, having the head of the GMDs come and talk to us, and that did actually happen last year. We had everyone, the head of the GMDs came and spoke with us and gave us a lot of good information, so I just thought I would mention that.
So, appreciate that. I personally think that could be a yearly thing, because a lot happens in a year. Yeah.
Representative Schmidt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Asprin, thank you so much. You've given us so many things to think about, and it's more than I can ask today, but I will ask a couple of questions. Having grown up in the area near the Ogallala Aquifer, and I know how it has receded. If I remember right, in my childhood, it was up to about the Waukene area, and it's moved further west. This is really concerning to me. You said you don't believe, apparently, if I'm understanding correctly, the current use out of the Ogallala, it will eventually deplete it. And how long are you looking at there? And also, another question I have, you said it's not recharged very well. Can you give us some kind of quantification at how it is recharged?
I can share with you a little bit, but we have experts, the Kansas Geologic Survey, that study that year-round. And they have maps, and I think they probably presented some of those maps to the committee last year that maybe you could get access to. That gives some projected decline rates and life of the aquifer as just a general rule of thumb. So we've had those types of maps for years, probably a couple decades now, if not more. And the big thing that I have seen or I believe that has changed in our overview or what we factor in evaluating those maps now is we now have to also think about the water quality. It's not like just drinking out of a cup and you know, well, I've got a quarter of the cup left, so that's how much time I have left. All of a sudden, when we get down to that quarter cup, the concentrations of whatever the contaminant may be in there could make that water almost unusable, so we may not even actually have a quarter cup left. We may have very little of any left. And so that's where I think that factoring in what is going to be the domestic need as we establish goals, I'm not sure that that's in the equation right now. And personally, I think we should put that into the equation. So.
One more quick, and please excuse my ignorance. I'm new on this committee, so I'm not as well versed in this topic as others. But you also mentioned then domestic use. Am I correct in understanding? I believe we had testimony previously said that about 80% of the water that's used in Kansas is agricultural purposes. Is that including the domestic use by farms, or is that only for crops?
I think when you hear the 80% term, that's generally referring to irrigation, and that would not include the domestic that I'm talking about. The domestic is unquantified because they're not required to be a matter of record. They're not required to be metered. They're not required to submit those annual records. And I have to keep saying, we're not asking for that either, though. Please don't misunderstand me. But I want to make sure that we understand the importance of that use of water and start bringing that into our planning and administrative processes.
Representative Minix.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to try to lay out something that may help Representative Newland and Smith slightly. I represent 3 counties in GMD 1 and multiple counties in GMD 4, which overlie the Ogallala Aquifer. We're blessed to have the geological studies that are done out there on a township basis, or 36 square miles. And 1 well's tested in each year for depth and to see what our water levels currently are. And yet excuse me, can you hear me?
I can hear you, yeah.
And then each irrigation user out there and everyone that has a permit, my stock water, we report our usage every year. And there's been some excellent models developed on what we think the Ogallala can be on a very scientific basis. And yet, if you look at what we're sampling in those areas, each 36 square mile area could be entirely different than another, and the usage of that water and the longevity and the quality also. It's kind of like we almost need the GMDs to do the site-specific things or small areas, because it can vary as much as each reservoir in the state of Kansas in the eastern part that you're accustomed to it's different in each reservoir, what the usage is and the water quality and how much you have. We're dealing with the same thing. It's just a bowl underground that we can't see as well. And so the modeling has helped out tremendously on our long-term planning. I think it's been a pretty good cooperative situation between the state giving some oversight and doing studies and allowing the local units of the GMDs to do something site-specific to their particular locations. Am I close?
Absolutely, fully agree.
Thank you.
Online, Representative Stogsdill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is always a fascinating topic for me because I live about as far east as I do live as far east as you can without actually stepping over into Missouri. And I'm certainly not an expert on Western Kansas, but I've driven through there many times. I've flown over it a lot, and I'm always amazed at the number of crop circles we see out there that are lush and so on due to irrigation out there. And it just seems to me that we have a water problem because we have a crop problem. And are we going to be able to sustain the types of crops that we're growing out there in Western Kansas right now that are obviously heavily reliant on water? Or is Farm Bureau looking at or working with other resources like Kansas State or something like that to see if there are other crops that are more that don't need as much water that could be grown out there and still create a vibrant economy in Western Kansas? Because it looks to me like the crops we're growing out there, if we continue growing those crops, we're going to be in big trouble. And maybe you can enlighten me on that.
Yeah, that's a good question for somebody, probably not me. But that's a very good point, very good question. Yes, research is continually ongoing in terms of finding crops that are less water intensive. Of course, markets, the Farm Bill, the landowner's preference on what crops he or she grows, it all come into play. It would be very dangerous to start getting into the role of dictating what crops folks can and cannot grow. I tend to stay more over in my lane of how much water we use and leave farming up to our members who are expert in that, not me. And so I view it more as a water management issue than determining what crops we grow. And like I said, I am probably not the person for that question, but that's my best shot.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Vaughn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Asprin, for coming today and speaking on a lot of these important issues. I just also wanted to kind of call back to Representative Smith's question because it is something that I'm really concerned about as well in terms of how much usable life left we have and what recharge numbers look like. And if it wasn't out of line, I know we maybe have another expert in the room, Mr. Letourneau, who might be able to speak to that. And I don't know if it would be okay to invite him to maybe give some of those numbers.
Sure.
Okay. Mr. Letourneau, is that okay with you? Just so, sorry to put you on the spot here.
Welcome to the committee on short notice.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Hi, committee. I'm Lane Letourneau. I'm the program manager for the Water Appropriation Program for Kansas Department of Agriculture's Division of Water Resources. And you know, we, in cooperation with the Geological Survey, our staff goes out and we measure 1,400 wells each year. And I don't have the map in front of me, but it ranges from, we've got many areas that, what the KGS puts together is a 200 gallon per minute well. And in Earl Lewis, the chief engineer, he had that map. Well, the Ogallala ranges from areas that have less than 25 years left. Many of them have less than 25 years left down. But if you go south into Stevens County, there's 100 years of water left. And so it's quite a range, as Representative Minix brought up. We've got wells less than 50 gallons a minute, but we still have wells that are 1,000 gallons a minute. So.
Thank you, Ms. Letourneau. And do you know what the recharge is in across the state generally for the aquifer?
You know, we've calculated it less than an inch. I think is what the models show, is less than an inch of recharge. As Kent brought up, though, GMDs 1 and, GMD 2, where the Equus beds are, and GMD 5, or the Big Bend, they're blessed with recharge. I mean, we see 6 inches of recharge, 2 inches to 6 inches of recharge in those GMDs.
Great, thank you so much. And I have one more question for Mr. Askren, if I may. And thanks, Lane. Sorry again for putting you on the spot there. Thank you, Mr. Askren. I think Ms. Letourneau's answers too really point to the importance of local involvement in these decisions and making sure that they're a big part of the solutions that we come up with. And you talked a lot about the kind of specific goals and remedies, and I think we've encouraged GMDs to come up with some of those goals and remedies, but we're still faced with this really uphill battle to try and do meaningful action to conserve the aquifer. So I was just kind of wondering, do you have ideas about specific goals or remedies, or what that process could better look like to ensure that we're taking meaningful action to conserve the aquifer? Because, I'm really glad we're on the same page about the indefinite use of the aquifer. I think it's so important for our rural communities, and we want to let local communities guide the way, but looking at ways that we can better support them to ensure that we're doing everything we can to conserve that water. Thank you.
Yeah, how do we come up with those goals? It's a delicate balance. We want to definitely encourage the local control, the local input, because the locals are the ones that will have to live with the results of those outcomes. So we want to make sure that that is done. But then and that's why I encourage everyone to take a look at the Groundwater Management District Act and understand that, are we fulfilling the statutory direction of the GMD Act? And that was all part of what I said about communication between the GMDs, DWR, the legislature. Everybody, I think, has some skin in the game here, some more than others. And we certainly do not want to ever discount that local stakeholder input. But I think there needs to be, even within the state water planning, we need to probably have a little more specific goals than we've had in the past. That's why I appreciate having extend and conserve for all these years. But is that good enough moving forward? And so does that start at the top, or does that start at the very bottom? I'm not exactly sure I know. But it needs to start somewhere, and we need to work towards each other to figure out what that really needs to look at, and then how do we implement it, which will even be a bigger challenge.
Certainly. Thank you so much, Mr. Askren. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Further questions? Representative Smith, one more time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You mentioned about domestic use, and you talked about wells for irrigation and things like that, for yards, for lawns. Mm-hmm. In the area where I live, in parts of Wichita, when they bring in a new development, they drill a well on every home, basically, and it's used for irrigation. Is there, that seems like kind of wasteful to me. Is there any thought about, is there any restriction on that, or is that just something anybody can do?
Well, there's always the potential for restrictions, because even though domestic rights are not subject to the application process that all other uses are, they still fall under the same water law. So they would not be allowed to impair someone, waste water, all of those sorts of things. But in general, the chief engineer does not require permits for that. Now, there have been certain cases where there's been a need, and the chief engineer has stepped in. This goes a little too far back from my memory banks. Lane could probably help us out on this, but I know Hayes had a situation like that probably 25 plus years ago, where domestic rights actually had to be curtailed or managed in a way that they aren't elsewhere. So that's one thing that can be done. Then there are also some municipalities I know that have actually enforced some codes or something where they are requiring, I'm not going to go far as say it's permitting, it may be, but I'm not sure about that, but at least a registration or where these are at for contamination concerns, making sure the wells are properly drilled and that we don't have a contamination issue. And it also gets into the stormwater issues. So this is a little outside of my area, so I won't go too much further, but we do have some folks in the room that could probably help with that. But in general, they're not regulated, but I think maybe to answer your question, they can be if the situation is right.
Representative Minix.
Thank you. I may muddy the waters a little bit here, but if a GMD is considering a water conservation area or a LEMA, the people that can vote on that are actually the ones that have permitted rights, generally.
Okay, well, we kind of mixing apples and oranges maybe here. A water conservation area generally, and there are no formal rules, so I'm not exactly sure how that would be viewed. Again, Lane probably is the one I have to answer that. But a water conservation area is generally a voluntary conservation plan that you impose upon yourself or a group of individuals impose upon themselves. A LEMA is proposed by the Groundwater Management District Board, elected officials, through overview by the chief engineer before it is implemented. So and that's mandatory, or can be mandatory. So I don't know if that answers your question, but they're different. WCA, you're pretty much in the driver's seat. LEMA, you may not be so much.
Appreciate your answer there. I guess the point I was trying to get to eventually here was the distinction. We do not permit those domestic uses, and yet they are impacted by the decisions voted upon by the people who do have permits. And so even when someone is voting on a LEMA, it may impact people that have a domestic use in their particular house, or as you mentioned, if it's 80% of the usage is industrial or permitted, and the other 20% within a region is domestic, that domestic is impacted by the decisions of the group who have the permits. And if you run out of water in your house, that makes a huge difference. That's what I was trying to get.
Absolutely, fully agree.
Thank you.
Representative Vaughn.
Sorry, one more question here. Thank you, Mr. Askren. I know how much our local farmers respect Farm Bureau and work with you all to implement a lot of programs. And, I think we can be really good partners in this. And, part of that too is a lot of education around potentially water saving irrigation technology or sustainability education, things like that. And I'm wondering, is there any of that the Farm Bureau is kind of currently doing with farmers? Or are there ways that, they'd be willing to partner with the state to help offer that information to farmers? Because, I think it's such a great solution to use these really efficient technologies, but part of the problem too is making sure that everybody knows how to use them. And I think we heard a comment the other day that farmers learn the best from farmers, and you guys are the epitome of that. So I just didn't know if you had any thoughts or comments around that.
Well, I think the short answer would be yes. Farm Bureau has a broad media presence with our members. Some of them probably get a little overwhelmed sometimes by the amount of information that we share with our members. And as I mentioned earlier, we have 105 county farm bureaus. We gather annually for our business meeting. We have speakers on all topics come in to help educate our members as they consider ultimately topics that they vote upon that end up in our policy book, and that folks like me come to the Capitol and share with you all to help persuade you in your decisions. But we also have a whole education team. We have county meetings that staff attend on a regular basis to share information with. I'm sure I've left out a bunch, but we have, that is a very significant goal and objective of Kansas Farm Bureau, is to educate our members on issues so that they can make decisions that help them run a profitable and sustainable operation. So.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, you guys have a wonderful network, and I think that's a great opportunity to share that information. So I was just interested to know. But thank you for your response. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Now it's my turn. I'm going to piggyback on Representative Vaughn's comments. We have found in the committee that educating the public is a big hill to climb. We've done our best so far, but your organization has been stated, you have a big reach across all 105 counties. And I think we'd like to approach you with a piece of education piece that we put together here that we want to get out to the public, just education piece primarily. And if you'd be interested in that, we would, you tell us who to speak to and we'll go talk to them.
Absolutely. Let's visit and I'll get you in touch with the right people.
Okay. You talked briefly about, in just a short sentence, one roof. You're opposed to a one roof idea. Would you expound on that a little bit?
Well, as you can imagine, landowners are a little bit apprehensive. Maybe a little bit's not the right. They're quite apprehensive of regulation, and you've all had enough experience through this committee work to know the authority that resides with the chief engineer. Chief engineer basically decides who gets water and who doesn't, based upon the guidance of the Water Appropriation Act. That is an enormous stick. And I have seen people throughout my career who absolutely hate that, and many people who want that. And so I think it works quite well, has been my experience. But the point is, it's a tremendous authority. We also know that our Kansas Department of Health and Environment does a great job of trying to, and these are my words, nobody else's, sort of give us a little bit of buffer between them and the EPA and the Clean Water Act. And so if we were to take that authority that KDHE wields and the authority of the chief engineer and blend them together, our members are quite concerned about that. We like them to be independent. We don't want them to fall under one administration where we simply want them to enforce the law, not to become political whims. That would be one of our biggest concerns. And so I don't know if that answers your question, but I guess the point I'd want to make is we do have explicit policy that is opposed to that one roof concept.
Well, I think, speaking for the committee, we've heard that over and over again all through the process, that we need those authorities to have their separation. So we can agree on that. The goals, I think you addressed the goals with either Representative Vaughn or somebody else's question on how we come about that. But that brings up a big question. Who's going to be invited to the table to talk about those goals? And we'll need suggestions from everyone out there how we're going to sit down and do that. I'm not saying we, a group needs to be devised to sit down and look at the goals realistically, apolitically, and say, this is for the future of our state. How are we going to set these goals realistically? And in some cases, it may be a little harsh on some areas, but we have to do it. And then they come to the committee or to the legislature and say, we need help in this area, whatever. But we'll work on that. The most senior right, I get the feeling you have a little heartburn with the domestic water rights. So Did I read you right?
Heartburn? No, I don't have heartburn. I have concern, great concern for them, because I think they have been taken for granted and sort of, because they are not required to have that permit, I think they kind of become stepchild water rights, and that couldn't be any further from the truth. They're as valid as any other water right in the state. They're just unrecognized unless the owner takes the initiative to go to the Division of Water Resources and get them recognized. And quite honestly, that usually only happens once there's a problem. I think from a planning standpoint, we need to be preemptive and recognize some level of domestic need out there before we get to the point where we can no longer meet it. That's my big concern.
Well, that brings up the other point that Representative Minix brought up, 80-20. 80% of the water is being used by a group, and the domestic users are being left out of that conversation. How do you propose we get that 20% with involvement in?
Well, the education part, the 20%, quite frankly, don't even know they exist.
They're becoming aware, I'll guarantee you.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it's usually the day after the water quit coming out of their faucet, and then is it too late? So yeah, I think there's a huge educational component there that to get people to be aware of that. And you're right, some are becoming aware of that. We were actually had a conversation with a member at our annual meeting this year up in Northwest Kansas that was very concerned about his domestic water supply. And so I wish it would get a little higher on everybody's radar than it is right now, but I think that educational aspect is going to be critical.
Thank you for that. Any further questions from the committee? Anybody online? Okay. Mr. Askin, thank you very much for coming. We appreciate the information and you're standing for questions. It's great to have you. Thank you. One thing we talked about in committee yesterday, I believe, was the Governor's Water Conference and the documents that were presented there. If I could have research find those documents or at least the links and either put them on the S drive or share them with the committee members so they can see that, I'd appreciate that. Anything else for the good of the committee? Seeing none, we are adjourned. Have a good weekend.